Good morning, everyone in the US. Good afternoon for all our attendees in Europe. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Markus. I'm one of the two or three hosts here, together with Christina Maria Huber and Julia Kredels from Resource or Solar Europe. Thank you so much for joining. We have a great webinar lined up for you today. Let me jump straight into the agenda. Actually, one quick note, we are recording this webinar. We will make it available afterwards on YouTube. Stand by for, well, I think you'll just find it, but we might send out an email. But just make sure you are all aware of that. And I also want to flag, you will be able to ask your question, of course, as always at the end. And feel free to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A function, and we will get to them at the end. So what is the goal? Did we put together this webinar? We want to make sure on the one side that you all get a sense of the intersection of carbon accounting and clean energy procurement, especially from a European perspective, also with the EU regulatory developments that have been happening, and giving basically, especially our US audience, a better sense of the sustainability rules that are coming in the EU. And then lastly, we want to make sure that all of you leave this webinar with a better sense what the revisions are, both in the greenhouse gas protocol side and the EU, and how you get support from us, and also what you can do yourself to get engaged. The agenda today, just quick introductions. Then I will talk us through the Scope 2 revisions of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the public consultation that has just started. Christina will then launch us into an update on EU sustainability and carbon accounting. And then we'll make sure we have time for all questions for all of you. With that, let me first introduce myself and then Christina as well. And I will get us started, and then Christina, I'll ask you to jump in quickly. I'm Markus Walther. I'm with the Clean Energy Buyers Association. So CEBA is for short. We have about 400 members that are energy buyers, also energy developers and solution providers, such as marketplaces for renewable energy certificate trading and things like that. I'm the director of greenhouse gas accounting and standards at CEBA, and so my role is to follow what's happening in the greenhouse gas protocol world and also SBT and other initiatives, and make sure that your concerns are heard there. And Christina is with Solar Europe. Christina, I'll let you quickly introduce yourself.
Yes, gladly. Thank you very much for the introduction, Markus. My name is Christina Maria Huber. I am a senior policy advisor on sustainability at SolarPower Europe, the leading European association for solar and batteries. And I'm speaking here today on behalf of the Resource platform, a corporate energy buyers platform that I'll be introducing in more detail in my section a little bit later, of which SolarPower Europe is a founding member. I'm the expert at SolarPower Europe for carbon topics and have a background in environmental sustainability. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you today and to be able to help you see also next to the very, I think, present greenhouse gas protocol discussion, what's happening on the European side. Back to you, Markus.
Thank you, Christina, and also quick shout out. Thanks so much, Juliet, for joining us from Resource as well. We really grateful to have you here and help us with making sure all the questions get channeled to us. All right, with that, let me jump into the first part here, the Scope 2 revision of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So the goal here is to give you a sense of what is happening, what is the timeline, and what are the key things you need to know for the next steps. First of all, what is the Scope 2 guidance and why does it matter? So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a nonprofit that has developed a couple of standards for greenhouse gas accounting, and that Scope 2 guidance, from our perspective, for our members, is one of the most important standards for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, because it gives guidance for how you measure and how we report emissions related to electricity use, as well as heat and steam and all that. And I want to highlight just quickly two key aspects of this. The Scope 2 guidance, the existing Scope 2 guidance, which was created in 2015, so it's been around for about 10 years. It has, I would say, mainly has two key aspects to it. There's a location-based method and there's a market-based method. And just to very quickly give an example of this, so let's take a US example. If you have a factory somewhere in the northwest of the United States, with the location-based method, you could say, okay, our Scope 2 emissions, our emissions related to energy use, electricity use especially, we basically look at the local grid. Let's say the local grid has maybe an emissions intensive, say 400 metric tons per gigawatt hour. let's say we use 100 gigawatt hours a year. Therefore, we can just say how we can report our how many CO2 tons we have induced basically through our electricity consumption. That's the location-based method. So basically, you just use the local grid. Very importantly, there's a second method called the market-based method. Let's again say the same factory, same everything's the same, but what changes now is that if you're a company that wants to show that you're doing what you can to reduce emissions, there's an opportunity here to show that you can buy clean energy elsewhere. If your local grid, if your local utility is not able to give you more clean energy than you want, more energy, clean energy, then you can buy, for example, you could go enter a power purchase agreement or a virtual power purchase agreement, or you could buy renewable energy certificates, as we call them in the US, guarantees of origin, I think in the UK, basically energy attribute certificates that show that you are buying clean energy elsewhere. And so what this has done, the fact that you're able to do this as a company, it gives you a lot more agency. So the market-based method has allowed companies to invest in clean energy, to buy renewable energy certificates in the US or GEOs, whatever you want to call them, buy them elsewhere, and therefore report lower emissions. So that's been a huge motivating factor for companies, and this has had real impact. So I want to just mention 3 stats here. So this market-based method has driven a lot of deployment of clean energy. In the US, our numbers state that about 40% or more than that, 40% of new US clean energy capacity additions are driven by corporate procurement. So it's a huge impact in that regard. We also have seen our another association in the US has showed that of the PPAs that or basically all clean energy projects that are being built, if you want them to get financed, you need to show that you have an offtake agreement. So it really helps when you have a corporate offtaker that says, if you build a solar plant or wind plant or what have you, we will buy the output from that. And so 94% of all projects built in 2023 had an offtake agreement in place for that reason, because it really stabilizes the investment for this, the financing. Let me move on from here. So that's the existing Scope 2 guidance. There's now an ongoing revision of that Scope 2 guidance. I want to quickly talk about the structure of the governance and also how the decision-making criteria are used in this revision. So as I mentioned, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a nonprofit. It's co-hosted basically by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So 2 nonprofits. There's a steering committee. There's an independent standards board, and joined by a secretariat. And then lastly, but not least, there's like the technical work group. So there's different technical work groups for different standards. We're talking here specifically about the Scope 2 standard, and so there's a technical work group that has been developing different ideas how to revise and update the Scope 2 guidance. That's the governance. In terms of decision-making criteria, I mean, I'll first say recognize that this is a very difficult project. You have a lot of stakeholders. It's a very complex topic. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has issued has basically 3 criteria for how they make decisions for the guidance. One is integrity, so scientific integrity, scientific principles. That's the number 1 criterion. Number 2 is impact, so the standards are meant to support ambitious global climate actions and programs. Back to the point I made earlier about corporate impact, for example. And last, feasibility to implement. So these are 3 criteria. They are meant to use together for any decisions that the protocol makes. And the guidance is basically that they should use all 3 of those, but if there's a conflict, if there's trade-offs between them, then there's a hierarchy that first comes the integrity, then comes impact, and then comes feasibility. That's from the perspective of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the decision-making criteria. All right, so what does it all mean? Like, why do we need to talk about this right now? Well, as I mentioned, the Scope 2 guidance was issued in 2015, but it's for, I would say, about something like 2 years. The protocol has started getting the pieces in place to start revising this. And we're at a key point right now because there's a public consultation, the first of 2 public consultations, as you can see on the left side, that has just started this week. So on Monday, October 20, the public consultation has started. It will last through December 19. And so this is the first of 2 public consultation periods. We think this is the most important one because we're at the point basically where we have different recommendations from the technical work group. The independent standards board has looked at those, has made basically their decision what they want to move forward to this public consultation, and now is a time where people can give their opinions on the proposed revisions. There are two surveys. One is the Scope 2 survey, and one is longer name, the electricity sector consequential methods. We'll get more into that in a second. I'll point out the Scope 2 survey is about 180 questions, and the electricity sector consequential methods is over 50 questions. So two big surveys that are due by December 19. I also want to flag that there are two options, especially I'm speaking here for corporates who may have internal pressures, what they can say in public, what they cannot. First of all, there's a non-attribution option. That would mean that if you submit feedback, you can ask for this. Then you can submit your feedback. Your feedback will be published, but it will not contain your name. It will not contain the name of your organization, and it will also not contain the name of your the country where you're from. That's the non-attribution part. There's also an option to request confidentiality. So the difference here is confidentiality would be that you give your feedback to the greenhouse gas protocol, but it will not become public. Nothing of that will become public. However, if you want to do that, you have to request that. So you have to request, before you submit any feedback, you have to request it by December 1, and it has to be approved. And it's based on the language we've seen, like this is not something that you can just choose by default. It's more like you have to have reasons for it. But basically, I just want to highlight this, especially the non-attribution part. There's an option for that. Ultimately, the Scope 2 guidance will become final at the end of 2027. And again, the public consultation, that's the key thing we're talking about here. So what is actually being proposed? On a high level, the revision aims to increase the accuracy in matching of your electricity use and your basically the generation of electricity and the consumption of electricity. So when I say matching, specifically I mean when you buy, say you buy electricity from your local grid and you use market-based instruments. So basically like, RECs, GEOs, all that there is more accuracy between that. That's the high-level intention behind this from the perspective of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. There are two main aspects to this. There's the inventory-based updates. So there's the location-based method and the market-based method that I mentioned earlier. And I'll quickly mention both those, the key factors here, the key changes. So in the location-based method, basically following the intention here of having more accuracy in the matching, the key changes are that for the location-based method, the emissions factor hierarchy is changing. So first, the spatial granularity was increased. So instead of having a national, for example, emissions factor on a national level, you use, for example, grid region level emissions factors. So the smallest boundary that's possible, that's available, that is the first priority. After spatial granularity, the next priority would be temporal granularity. So before it was annual matching. Now the preference is on high frequency data, so hourly data if available, otherwise monthly, otherwise annual. And lastly, there has been a definition of what accessible data is. So basically you have to use more granular hierarchies for emission factors when the data is available or accessible. Accessible means it's publicly available, it is free to use, and it's from a credible source. That's the location-based method. The market-based method, I think this is where I think I want people to spend the most attention to, because I think from our perspective, it has the most impacts. It has more restrictions. The proposed revisions would tighten the criteria for matching contractual instruments. One is there would be a requirement for hourly matching. There are some exceptions to this, but that's the intention here, the hourly matching. Second, when you use the market-based methods to match your usage to your consumption, to your procurement, there's also a deliverability requirement that is proposed. The idea is that you would have to source not just from anywhere in the world or even just the same country, but for the US and for Europe, it would have to be in the more restricted markets. So there's market boundaries that have not been clearly defined yet, but it would have to be something that basically could be reasonably be delivered. So it would be geographic tightening. There's two other changes that I'm not going to spend too much time on. We generally support the changes to the standard supply service and the residual mix. In the interest of time, let me skip those for right now. I'll just mention also there's a second survey, the one I mentioned earlier. So apart from the Scope 2 guidance, there's also an impact metric that's being discussed. This is something that's still ongoing development. So this is separate from the Scope 2 guidance now. The key intention is here that right now with the market-based method or the location-based method, you would just show how many kilowatt hours, for example, you have from the local grid versus how much have you bought on the market through market-based instruments. That's the inventory updates. But the idea is like, well, that doesn't really show you, if you just show how many kilowatt hours you bought from renewables, that doesn't actually show you how much the impact has been on reducing emissions in the grid. Because if you displace a gas power plant versus a coal power plant, that has a very different impact, right? That's the idea behind this. That's just high level. This is what's being discussed. This is, again, something that's still in development. You have high level questions in the survey. And the key question here is about the formula they're using. Just high level, the key changes here. With that, I also want to highlight two other aspects of this. One is feasibility measures that the protocol is proposing. So a couple of associations, including us, have basically flagged that we have feasibility concerns. The protocol is proposing four measures here to increase feasibility. One is that for hourly matching, you could use low profiles. So if you don't have hourly usage data, you could basically estimate it on a high level. There's also exemption thresholds, so small organizations would be exempt from some of the requirements. There is a legacy clause that's being discussed that existing contracts would not be affected, would still count for your targets. We'll get to that in a moment, actually. And then the phased implementation. So the idea is also that there would be transition phases, like the changes would not be implemented right away. I will say, so these are the four key things I think people should know in terms of what the protocol is proposing for feasibility. I think there's a lot of details that are still unclear at this point. So, for example, the exemption thresholds for size, the survey. What I have seen, we still have to go through the whole survey. But what I've seen is like there's asked, well, would you like 5 gigawatt hours, 10 gigawatt hours, or 50 gigawatt hours? What do you think would be the most meaningful threshold? And they would be in a deliverable market. Deliverable markets it's not definite yet what it would mean. It could be in the US, specifically in the United States. It could be deliverable markets like e-grid regions. DOE need studies or wholesale markets. So there's a lot of questions still about what exactly the boundaries would be here. The legacy clause, I just want to quickly say that there's a lot of discussion still within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol with a lot of different viewpoints, what actually that means. So it's not just is it there or not, like what shape would it take? And I think that really matters. And the phased implementation timelines, there's questions about that in the survey, but what exactly the timelines would be is also not certain yet. So high level, there's a couple of suggestions by the protocol for feasibility. And I think also say like this, it's important to chime in here because there's a lot of questions that are still open. All right, so that's this. I've given an overview here now what the proposed revisions are. I also want to spend a few moments on what CEBA's position is on this here. So again, I'm separating now, like I just give an overview what is happening. Now I want to share what is our viewpoint from the perspective of the Clean Energy Buyers Association. So we have some concerns about this. We very much understand the rationale behind it, the overall direction, but our key concern is that with the focus here on greater accuracy in matching, we've worried that this could have unintended consequences in terms of what the impact will be on markets. You're welcome to look at a public letter that we sent to the Independent Standards Board of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol in May, outlining basically these concerns that we have. And just to summarize on a high level, a lot of our energy buyer members have come to us voicing their concerns about the requirements of matching on an hourly basis and also using location matching. I think a lot of our members, and I think that's the CEBA's position. We think this is on a long term, this is where all the grids have to go in the world, everywhere in the long term. We think in the near future to make that a requirement for companies, CEBA's viewpoint is that this is going to be difficult to implement and not necessarily very efficient. And we basically fear that if you make this a requirement, not something that's optional, but a requirement, we are worried that this will make it harder for companies to continue in their voluntary procurement and that might just scale back their voluntary procurement. That's our big fear. And so that's the thing we want to avoid here. That's our viewpoint on now. With that, I want to hand it over to Christina for the perspective from Resource. Christina, please.
Thank you very much for that overview. I'd like to take you from talking about the details of the changes of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol on a more broad view of what's happening in Europe on this topic. I think it's super valuable to be having this webinar in general in order for more people to be aware of international and European discussions that are being had. And maybe also want to point out that Resource and SolarPower Europe don't have a position on the GHG protocol yet. So but we decided together with CEBA that this webinar is super useful to just share knowledge in general. And yeah, so thank you very much, Markus, for your overview. If you just want to head to the next slide, I'll be Yes, perfect. I'll be shortly introducing Resource to whoever doesn't know them or us yet. So Resource is essentially a coalition of energy buyers and suppliers, and looks to accelerate corporate renewable energy procurement in Europe through the use of tools such as PPAs, on-site generation, and renewable energy certificates. This is on the one hand to support corporate decarbonization, but also works in the broader framework of Europe's renewable energy goals and net zero goals. Next slide, please. So the work is happening on three main pillars. There's policy and advocacy work that is happening. Resource also works as a knowledge hub to help buyers benefit from new trends and to help renewable energy procurement market in general, and also looks to connect energy buyers with suppliers to facilitate the partnerships and share best practices in general, in the end with the goal of helping more corporates to procure renewables. And on the next slide, you'll get a short overview of who is in this network. So Resource was founded 2017 by four main founding partners. SolarPower Europe is one of them, and currently works basically has a strategic advisory board that looks at the direction and looks at to do this matching and so on and so forth, and has a lot of association partners as well across different industries and working closely together with them, as well as with national association partners on the ground in the different European markets that we have. And I'd like to take you on a little tour of the PPA market in Europe if you're not overly familiar with it. So we've seen really strong growth, especially with the start of the energy crisis in Europe. We've seen huge growth in the PPA market in Europe, especially from a booming solar market and a very steady wind market. In 2024 was a real record year for PPAs, following, as you can see, a number of well-performing years. But at the same time, next to the 2024, close to 13 gigawatt of corporate PPAs, we're seeing a slowdown in 2025. This is mainly due to some remaining barriers that are present in the renewable energy, in the PPA market in Europe, but also we're seeing a large amount of negative prices come up. So actually a month that was quite notable on this topic was the month of May, where in comparison to the month before, we saw an 80% drop in volumes that were being procured, which we consider worrisome in the broader spectrum. And we're seeing a general slowdown of renewable energy deployment in Europe as well. So obviously the data here is not for the full year yet. It's only for the first 6 months of the year, but we are seeing this growth slow down, which is something where of course we want to improve framework conditions to continue this strong decarbonization and PPA market. You'll have a short overview of the most important PPA markets in Europe on the next slide. So you see Spain, for example, which is simply historically the oldest PPA market with a lot of government support for PPAs, and low electricity prices as the top spot here. But for example, Germany has seen significant growth over the last couple of years because they've really implemented the faster permitting rules and therefore have deployed a lot of renewable energy in the last couple of years. So just to get you a little bit of an overview and to see also which markets have which renewable energy technologies specifically. So to move on to the topic of the webinar, it's to actually give you a view of the European sustainability policy and where PPAs and carbon accounting features in there. Thank you very much. Perfect. So you might or might not have heard of the Clean Industrial Deal. It was launched at the top of this year, so at the beginning of this year, as a follow-up to the European Green Deal. And you can really see already in the naming that there's a shifting of priorities that we're seeing across Europe. So the goal of the Clean Industrial Deal is to refocus on European industry, make it greener and more competitive, to reduce the cost of clean energy. That also goes hand in hand with clean energy deployment, of course, to support innovation more generally, boost the demand for sustainable products. And there's, of course, also the broad goal of cutting emissions and reducing reliance on imports and energy imports in particular. For PPAs, the role in European policy more broadly is a little bit in a dichotomy state, you could say. So on the one hand, we have policies such as the Clean Industrial Deal that are really seeing and identifying PPAs as key tools for European industrial competitiveness, to reduce costs, to hedge against price spikes. And what it was really an ask by industry as well to invest more in PPAs following the energy crisis. And on the other hand, we're seeing increased skepticism about the emission reduction impact or the emission reduction potential of PPAs and their renewable energy certificates. And there's concerns about third countries using lower value PPAs and guarantees of origin or renewable energy certificates, whatever you want to call it, to artificially lower their carbon footprints to then benefit in compared to European industry. So this is a conversation that we're having particularly in carbon footprint methodologies, and kind of shows that European policymakers can't really make up their minds on whether they think PPAs are a strong force for European industry or whether they might be a weakness. So if you could move on to the next slide. You'll have to click twice, I think. Yes. Where in the EU are we actually seeing legislation that includes carbon methodologies? So of course we have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which includes mandatory disclosure of corporate sustainability data. I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with it. And there we have mandatory disclosure of carbon footprints. And there the reference is to the GHG Protocol. So obviously a very strong support for this market-based methodology. Yes, there's dual reporting, but and everyone who has worked in corporate sustainability knows, Scope 2 is something that you can tackle quite directly through the use of PPAs to reduce the carbon footprint of your company and also products. Then when you move on to other legislation, such as the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, so this legislation, the idea here is to level the playing field between industrial products produced in Europe and abroad, to kind of make sure that there's less carbon leakage. So companies that are currently producing in Europe moving abroad in order to benefit from lowered environmental sustainability policy. So we want to prevent that and therefore support European industry, and also just to generally have a supporting framework or incentives for greener production globally. So usually what happens here is that certain products, when they're imported into Europe, they have to pay a carbon border tax. And within this calculation, of course, you have to figure out how to evaluate whether the carbon footprint abroad is higher than within a European made product. And here PPAs still play a role, and they have limited application. So it's not a go for all, but there's certain thresholds to which they can be applied. And then the discussion that we're focusing on right now, and that is also most relevant for me to highlight here, is the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation. So this one will actually be the first regulations where we'll have mandatory carbon footprint methodologies on product levels. And we're seeing this across. So the first regulations that kind of popped up with this topic were the ones on the electric vehicle batteries carbon methodology, and the eco-design for solar PV methodology. And over the last couple of years, because this is a debate that hasn't just started right now, it's been ongoing, we've moved from a scientific approach to a like somewhat emotionalized and politicized discussion around whether to accept whether to have default values in that carbon methodology. To use Markus's language from earlier, that would be location-based accounting, or recognizing supply-specific electricity, so market-based accounting. And so the discussion that we're having in Europe is not on the level of granularity that we want to be seeing in our carbon footprint methodologies on market-based. It's whether or not to accept market-based at all. And that is something that we think is really worrying, and which is why we wanted to highlight it also in this webinar and give you a good overview of the ongoing discussions here. So if you move to the next slide, you'll see, I just want to kind of reframe again why we think it's important for carbon methodologies to accept PPAs. I'm sure that most of the participants of this webinar are well aware of this, but I'd like to reiterate nevertheless. PPAs are a very important instrument to mobilize private capital for renewable energy projects. And these renewable energy projects, when deployed, will help reduce electricity prices. We know that this is a factual correlation. And as we saw earlier on the PPA, when I showed you the overview of the PPA market, we're seeing that this is particularly true for solar and wind. Then in addition, we think that PPAs and renewable energy certificates are very important decarbonization options for industries operating on carbon-intensive grids. And we think that beyond having, we really need consistent market signals within the EU regulatory frameworks. So we saw earlier that there's the broad clean industrial deal, and under the Renewable Energy Directive, and under a number of European legislation, PPAs are seen as this highly valuable industrial competitiveness factor. And then suddenly we're telling companies that, but this doesn't count when you actually want to bring a product onto the market. Lastly, there's also the factor that carbon accounting rules, having harmonized carbon accounting rules reduces administrative burden and improves transparency. And of course, this is relevant for companies that want to bring products to the market in multiple markets, on the one hand worldwide, but also within Europe. And I guess the most important point for me to make here is that we don't want carbon methodologies to be used as industrial policy. I think at the end of the day, carbon methodologies should be utilized to make products more sustainable. And we're seeing several countries trying to use sustainability policy in order to support European industry. So, for example, quite recently, there was a newly announced VAT regime in France for solar, so very specific, to lower, so special solar products would have to pay a lower VAT tax compared to less sustainable solar. And apparently it was initially designed in having in mind that these criteria would only be able to be met by French manufacturers, and because it included low carbon footprints and a number of other thresholds. But within a few weeks of them having announced it, there's already international manufacturers, Chinese manufacturers, saying that they will be able to meet this criteria as well. So while some countries are trying to use sustainability policy as industrial policy, I think it's important for everyone to note that there is countries worldwide that are innovative, that are working on decarbonization, that are working on circularity and sustainability, and that this is not purely a European thing, which sometimes gets lost in the conversation for some reason. Let's move on to the next slide, though. So now that you kind of understand the framework conditions, I just kind of wanted to shortly give you an overview of what we've done previously on this. So there's been several joint letters between Resource, SolarPower Europe, and a number of other stakeholders to bring this topic into the center stage and to try to influence this move towards location-based or default value emissions accounting, and to kind of bring back and underline the importance of PPAs and market-based instruments. So back in 2024, July of 2024, we published a joint letter calling for the recognition of PPAs in the carbon footprint methodology for EV batteries. Why this one? Because essentially this was one of the first methodologies in this whole spectrum of product legislation that we can expect, which will be a precedent for all kinds of sectors, for products across sectors. So this is where we jumped in to underline the importance of recognizing PPAs to reduce the carbon footprint of electricity. Closer towards the end of the year, in December 24, we then had a more broad alliance calling for the industries, so industries calling for the European Commission and member states to reconsider their approach, because there had been no progress made. And while the first of our joint letters was very specific to the EV's Batteries Delegated Act, the second was already a more broad coalition. And then our most recent joint letter is something that we published this year. So if you'll move to the next slide. Thank you. So quite recently, in September of this year, we actually went even broader than the EV Batteries Delegated Act and just a broad industry coalition. We actually went out there and found more than 40 signatories across industries. So about half of them are corporate stakeholders and half of them are associations, from anything from the automobile, chemicals, renewable energy, electricity in general field, to urge the European Commission to once again recognize these market instruments, PPAs and guarantees of origin, across carbon methodologies. Because we're hearing and seeing increasingly that our message has not landed so far, and that this is moving in a direction that we're not in favor of, and that would then hinder the PPA market in general when it's already suffering a little bit from broader market conditions, and that we need to reinforce it. And this was actually launched based on the fact that the Joint Research Center, which is the research arm of the European Commission, had previously already suggested methodologies that would include reliable and verifiable market-based instruments within them. But we haven't seen it reflected in methodology or in the delegated act so far, so in the legislation so far. So why is this? So I guess if you can move on a little bit, yes, to the last slide, or the next slide at least. Yes. So nope, one too far. Sorry, thank you. So the key takeaways from this, I guess, that I want to give you is that on the one hand, we have a PPA market in the EU that is strong, but it's definitely facing headwinds based on the market dynamics, such as negative pricing and shifting framework conditions. And having market-based instruments not be recognized in carbon methodologies is part of this uncertainty and bad shifting framework conditions that we are not supportive of, and that we really need to push back against. So then I've mentioned it earlier already, while on the GHG protocol, we're moving in the direction of more granularity for market-based instruments. Europe is taking a proper U-turn in the other direction to assess whether or not to even accept this at all, which is highly worrisome, and it's become highly politicized. So this is not a technocratic debate we're having, which the EU is usually known for, but this is a discussion that is happening now on member states level, on the level of the von der Leyen cabinet, and it's become highly politicized, and that's why we believe a lot of action needs to be done. Why is this debate also a little bit happening? I'm not sure if I've brought it across well enough. So some member states are worried that products that are manufactured abroad will use market-based instruments with lowered quality compared to, let's say, what we have in the EU, and therefore will have a competitive advantage in comparison to Europe's industrial base, which is struggling amidst a variety of factors. And so they're trying to use sustainability policy instead of industrial policy to address this factor, while our clear stance is that the two are separate, and sustainability policy should focus on decarbonization, not on industrial policy. For that, we actually need real industrial policy. There's also good movements that are happening, though. So we're seeing that there's member states that are willing to make a push for this topic and for our stance on this topic as well on the council level. So actually the Polish Climate and Energy Ministry is willing to lead a coalition and bring up this topic and this debate at the council level in order to resolve, and also in favor of accepting market-based instruments in carbon methodologies. And we're not completely alone with this industry call. Actually, just yesterday, we received some information where, so France, who is particularly in favor of using default values due to their historically low grid emissions with the whole bunch of nuclear that they have, they are also calling for the carbon border adjustment mechanism to stop recognizing market-based instruments, to stop recognizing PPAs, and to move to default values instead. And the climate commissioner's cabinet actually publicly stood out against that, saying, pretty much reiterating our position, which is that this would stop incentivizing companies to invest in decarbonization. So therefore, my call to you is that, be informed that this conversation is happening next to the greenhouse gas protocol discussion. And if you are in the position to discuss, if you're active in Europe, and if you are in the position to discuss with member state ministries to help us in bringing this topic to their awareness as well, and to help us form this coalition around Poland in favor of supporting market-based instruments and PPAs in the methodologies to defend the fundamental value add of PPAs and renewable energy certificates. I hope this was a good overview and clear enough. I know the European system is often a little convoluted in terms of all the different roles and stakeholders and such, but this is just a first step, I would say, in informing you. So actually in 2 weeks, if you go to the next slide, in 2 weeks, we'll be having the big resource event in Amsterdam, which is about connecting renewable energy buyers and sellers. And there's also the opportunity there. There's a bunch of panels that will be discussing things such as the GHG revision process, I believe. There's also something on ESG strategy. So this is an opportunity to take this conversation further. Or you can also, of course, always reach out to Resource year-round and get in contact with my wonderful colleague, Juliette. And the contact details are in the slides that will be shared with you. So that's it from my side.
Thanks so much, Christina. That was fantastic. Really appreciate the overview here. And I really appreciate your clear call to action, which I think is very important. I also wanted to add mine here, just at the end. The key takeaway from our side is on the greenhouse gas protocol side, the revision is happening. You have a chance right now to chime in. Please do that. Look, CEBA will submit comments, but please do not think that, well, CEBA is doing it, so no one else has to do. Please do it, because on our side, we will submit feedback, but it will be higher level than what most companies can answer, because we do not have the specific profiles that you have. We do not, for example, the exemption I mentioned earlier, the threshold, should it be 5 gigawatt hours, 10 or 50? You companies will have a much better sense what would work for you. How would you be impacted? So please submit your feedback. And as I mentioned before, you have until December 19. CEBA has actually filed a request to extend this timeline because we think it's going to be challenging for companies to get all this done by December 19. But even so, I think there's a couple of options for you to submit your feedback, as I mentioned, without attribution. So please take advantage of that. And since this is a lot, we also CEBA is putting together a bunch of resources and webinars and conference opportunities to talk about this. So I just want to keep this slide up for a moment to give you a sense of what CEBA, what tools potentially you can use from CEBA to help you get ready for this public consultation. With that, I would like to start the questions. So now this is always a challenging part because there's a lot of questions coming in. Juliet, actually, I'd like to get you the lead in this and start flagging the questions that came in.
Sure, happy to do so. So we had a question from Stefan who was saying, looking at what is proposed, more granular, smaller timeframes, it looks like the prices for guarantees of origin or equivalent will rise. Any idea on what this could mean?
I'm happy I'm happy to take a first quick step. I mean, yeah, we've had some discussion about this. It's a complex question. I mean, for example, I mean, I think from our perspective, we think on the one side, this is going to make it harder for clean energy projects to get financed from our perspective. If basically we think if fewer companies are willing to, on the one side, put in the extra cost that we think it's going to cost them to comply with all the new proposed rules, we think there's going to be less demand. That's our big concern. Now, less demand, that could have different impacts, right? Like less demand could also mean that prices go up. On the other side, for example, if energy attribute certificates from solar, for example, if they're in markets, for example, like California, where you have a lot of solar power, that could mean that, the RECs, as we call them in the US, the ones that are produced, during peak hours, they may be almost worthless because at that point there's plenty of that available already. Whereas the ones in the evening might become much more expensive. So I think there's a bunch of different factors could be happening here, and I think it's a hard question. I don't feel qualified to give a clear sense of what is happening there. I think it could be depends on how it pans out. I don't know if you, Christina or Juliet, if you have anything to add on that.
I personally don't. I have a company internal expert on GOs, but I'm the carbon expert, so I will defer to your assessment for now.
Fabulous, yeah. Christina, there is a question for you. You mentioned that there is a debate in Europe about whether to use market-based accounting at all. Do you think one of the reasons for this is that the current GO accounting system is not seen as credible or impactful? For instance, Norwegian GOs are used for clean production in Germany.
Yeah, so we do think actually that this is part of the issue as well. So because the GO system has its weaknesses in the current version, there's definitely space for improvement, and that I think that gave the space for criticism in the first place. I do think, though, however, that the broader discussion is really about industrial policy and about misusing sustainability policy for industrial policy, because from what I understand, it's really the big worry that instead of benefiting European companies, for example, in the solar sector, Chinese companies will benefit from the carbon methodologies because they have less strict rules, and they can therefore show that they have perfect carbon footprints, and that this just doesn't apply as well in Europe. So there's the question of safeguards. And in addition to that, or on that note, what I've heard as well is the factor that we're proposing, and the Joint Research Center is proposing methodologies that would take care of those safeguards and would take into consideration the quality of the GOs used and such, and verification. But that is a little bit in contrast to the simplification agenda that we currently have under the Commission's work program. So having a more complex carbon methodology is not working in our favor right now, even if we're maybe in the right of in terms of what it means and the effects and impacts. But I guess to come back to the beginning of this question, yes, I do think it plays a role, and the factor that it definitely plays a role that there's certain inaccuracies in the European GO system that is eroding confidence in PPAs and renewable energy certificates.
We also have another question on harmonized carbon accounting in light of the greenhouse gas Protocol and ISO collaboration. Could this increase administrative burden and not necessarily improve transparency and accuracy the way the consultation text claims? What are your views on this? Maybe
I
for
believe that's a question for Markus.
Markus.
Yeah, sorry, let me think about it. So it will be, I mean, let me start with this. I think this collaboration between a greenhouse gas protocol and ISO, I think it's something also people who have the bandwidth for this should pay attention to as well. We think on the one side, we think there is a need for harmonization. I think that will be benefit if companies have a clear sense where to go. On the other side, we are curious where this ultimately where the different stands are going to go, and we have. Well, I mean, maybe I'll just keep it at that. I think there's for us, it will depend a bit how this is going to pan out in terms of how for example, there's the Scope 2 guidance that we talked about. There's also a product standard that's being developed. There's a couple of other standards. I think for us, it's a question ultimately, the key question for us is always how are you going to make sure that stakeholders are involved in this in a way where we have, especially also, we think it's very important to have the practitioner voice in this. And so we think this is, from our perspective, this has been a bit lacking in the Scope 2 guidance revision. You have a technical work group that includes buyers, but typically that's been less than 20%. We think for the same counts for this new partnership, we think it's important that the standards make sure that they test the high-level concept, that makes sense in theory. Make sure you discuss this with practitioners and see what the impacts could be. So yes, I think the cost could go up. I have not spent enough time yet looking at the ISO standards that they're going to work on. But yeah, let me keep it at that.
Great, thank you. Christina, there's a question about SolarPower Europe and whether they are monitoring different legislations where market-based measures and PPAs could be included.
The answer is yes. We are monitoring, and especially, of course, currently the Battery Delegated Act and the PV Eco Design, which are the ones that I'm currently most aware of. But for example, we recently responded to the carbon accounting methodology for a potential downstream expansion of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So yes, essentially everywhere where carbon methodologies pop up, we try to have a view and understand of how they are applied within the different European legislative contexts. And I do think that dual reporting, for example, having a location-based and a market-based approach, as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol kind of historically does, is a decent approach, and it's something that's been echoed by the cabinet of the climate commissioners, so the climate commissioner's office, and that's something that we could live with very well. In terms of transparency, we just really want to make sure that market-based instruments have a role to play going forward in European carbon methodologies.
Right, we've got a few more questions coming in. So one question is has anyone consulted national EAC registries if hourly matching is feasible? Because apart from issuing hourly GOs, they will be expected to issue cancellation statements on an hourly level for each off-taker.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure how much. I think I cannot say much about I don't know how deeply the discussion there has been. I think again, I feel like generally that is a concern I have generally, that I think practitioner voices from our perspective have been a bit underrepresented. So, but I don't know exactly.
We also have a question again about hourly. So could it be that the problem with hourly is not only practical, but also fundamental? Even with tighter constraints, there's no way to track electric current. Also, 24/7 targets are not 100% renewable. They are typically, for example, 80% carbon free. This can be easily achieved with zero impact on the transition by cherry picking the cheaper hours and using baseload nuclear and large hydro. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I think that is one concern that we have generally too. Like I mentioned, right, the intention is to increase accuracy in the matching, but again, as a concept, we fully agree with that. that this should be not that should be something like we generally want to work towards. But at the same time, are you actually achieving this in practice? So the point here is that if two companies both say we're matching 50%, we're accomplished 50% of our electricity use to be matched with carbon-free electricity, but one of them does it during the peak solar hours, for example, and where it's easy, and the other one tries their best to use storage and other things in the evening. So the two companies, a lot of the arguments is well, it's going to be more comparable. Companies are going to be reporting in a way that's more comparable. I would argue not necessarily. It's still ultimately comes down to the details. And the other point here about the accuracy here, about there's no way of tracking electricity currents. We understand, for example, the example of Norway comes up a lot, right? But I think from our perspective, the key concern here is that because if you as a concept, if you try to be more accurate, yeah, that sounds good to be more accurate. But from our perspective, like what do you gain with the accuracy? Because ultimately, if you have a system that for example, if you source your electricity from somewhere that's instead of I don't know, 2,000 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers away or miles, if you have it 500 miles or 500 kilometers, yeah, that's closer. But then, do you still know, for example, are you sure that the electricity can actually be transmitted? Because there's also in some grids there's a lot of constraints on where during peak hours, for example, where electricity can flow to. So ultimately, from our perspective, what matters is that we get as much clean energy on the grid as possible. And from our perspective, that has been largely driven by market-based instruments with corporates because they have an option. They're empowered to do something personally rather than just wait for electric utility companies to do it for them. And so that's our big concern here.
So maybe to jump in on this as well, because you mentioned the Norway example, and I'm not sure everyone is familiar with it. But so what's happening in that case, whether it's Norway or Iceland, so the grid isn't as obviously the Norwegian grid is connected to the European mainland, but the amounts of electricity that are flowing and that are being exchanged with neighboring countries and with mainland countries is about 1/4 of the amount of GOs that are being sold by by Norway. So there's a mismatch, and I think part of the move is towards having increased accuracy in terms of this locational aspect, that you're only maybe allowed to actually buy the same amount of GOs that are actually being transmitted. So, and that's something that's this has entered the awareness of European parliamentarians, for example. We've had conversations with people on this that they say, okay, they've heard about this, they understand this, they think it's absurd that in Germany you can buy renewable energy from Iceland because in this case there's even no physical link. So I think there's definitely some avenue and some space for improvements that needs to be taken over time. Once again, whether that means hourly matching or not, I think hourly matching definitely has its difficulties, as you've been pointing out, but that doesn't mean that there's no changes at all needed.
I'm conscious of time. We do have 2 more questions, and I saw one more in the chat as well. So is it your understanding that the GHG protocol wants energy certificates, hourly granularity, to be traded prior to delivery of the electricity, similar to spot markets for electricity, or can they be procured after the delivery? Maybe a question for Markus.
I'm not sure about this, honestly.
Something for us all to look into. I saw in the chat we also have a question. Is it fair to say that the weakness of the current GO construct, feeding market-based objections, is proof that we need to strengthen the time and location rules in order to protect the system?
As I was saying previously, I felt like this was a little bit directed at me, and my answer is pretty much what I've said before. I think it plays part of the role. In Europe, at least, for the profound discussion over market-based yes or no, I think it gave part of the kindling to the discussion. But I think the broader issue here is really the misuse of trying to misuse sustainability policy for industrial policy. Don't know if you have something to add, Markus.
I mean, I'm just trying to think, I think the key thing is that I think we're all in agreement that this is time to reform the protocol. There are weaknesses in the current system. I think there's if you talked about things that, for example, also CEBA disagrees with, there are many things also that we agree with, and we support many aspects of the reforms. It's just the key thing I would say is I think any system device will have weaknesses. There's always a way to abuse it one way or another. We should try to minimize abuse of that. But I also just think keep being mindful of the overall impact. If to me, I sometimes think about discussions that happen in about welfare, for example. Like there's always, if you have welfare payments, some people will abuse them. You can make it stricter. You could restrict the amount of welfare that people can get, or make it harder to get it. And you reduce abuse, will you reduce overall impact, the benefits from that too? So that's a high level thought I have about that. All right, I realize we are at time, but I just want to just thank you very much, all of you, for attending. Big thanks for Christina and Juliette for making this a wonderful bi-continental exchange here. I enjoy these conversations. Thank you all, also everyone who had questions and comments. We will make this recording publicly available. You'll see it on YouTube. And I just want to say again, thank you everyone for joining, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you so much, Markus and Juliette, and thanks for everyone who joined. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.